Hello guys, this is your friend and we are back with a new fanfic. Which is what if Naruto and Sakura Yamanaka were in secret relationship during the chunin exam, part 1. And if you enjoy this fanfic then please press the like button and subscribe to my channel for more fanfic like this. And now let's start the fanfic. Sakura Yamanaka was born the day the cherry blossoms bloomed. She was a bit late. Her mother had expected her nearly 2 weeks before, but she was healthy and a good weight, if a bit larger than her mother would have preferred. She was the 11th child in her family, but she wouldn't know that for months. Sakura's first weeks passed in a blur of sensations. She didn't really comprehend the passing time, and to a large extent she wasn't yet conscious. As the weeks pulled into months, however, that began to change. There wasn't really a moment, a sudden sensation of being. Instead, Sakura's consciousness developed over the hours, days, weeks. Her ability to remember past sensations slowly improved, as did her ability to receive new ones, especially by sight. Her feelings about the world about her became stronger, and she suddenly found herself having a deep affection for the woman who could only be her mother as well as the various other caretakers that passed in and out of her life. She slowly began to realize that each of them spoke, made sounds in a certain order to convey messages, but that she had yet to understand the code. Most importantly, she figured out that something was very, very wrong. Because it wasn't just Sakura's thoughts in her head, and it wasn't just that at her age Sakura shouldn't be thinking at all. It was Arden's thoughts that were the problem. Which was not to say they were much clearer than Sakura's own. In fact, at first it was impossible to tell the difference between the two. It was only as time passed that it became clear that some of her memories, some of her knowledge, and some of her awareness could not have come from this world. This all, of course, took a backseat to real life. It didn't really matter that she, or Arden, knew how plants grew when she had not, despite her best efforts, managed to hold back her bladder and was therefore very, very uncomfortable. Also sleep. Sleep was really nice, and, at least according to Arden, surprisingly easy to do in this body. The older Sakura got, though, the more, Arden, began to fade. She'd already been, at best, half-formed the first time Sakura thought of her as a separate entity, with huge chunks of her life missing and what little remained piecing itself together the best it could. But even that began to vanish, more and more of what Arden knew but Sakura didn't disappearing every day. Neither particularly like that. In the end it was Arden who decided what to do next. Sakura was still swimming in and out of existence and even given the advanced abilities she did have thanks to her shared brain it wasn't quite enough to actually form a plan, much less put it into action. Arden, fortunately, was still fully capable of that, so that was what she did. Beginning when Sakura was about 2 months old, around the same time that she became fairly certain that Ka-san meant mother and that, given that the other, smaller humans around her used the same name to refer to her primary caregiver, she had siblings as well, Arden pulled her sharply away from the world. Immediately her senses dulled and her ability to control her physical body all but disappeared. Arden needed the processing power, needed all of Sakura's processing power, to ensure that the infant would retain at least some of the information that Arden threw at it rapid fire, only ever pausing to allow Sakura to sleep when it became too much. Her body, somehow, stayed alive despite her making no active effort to use it. Her mind, on the other hand, swelled. Arden had started with a story, of all things, or at least something that her memories interpreted as such. It was of a boy named Naruto, and the story came in fragments, randomly jumping from one point to another with almost nothing in between. Sakura recognized some aspects of the story. One quick scene, which Arden could not fully recall, included the energy chakra, apparently that one of her brothers had used on her after she'd banged her wrist onto the edge of her mother's bedstand. The shinobi running up and down walls was a common theme, too, and she was fairly sure she saw at least 2 of her siblings doing just that before she was pulled away from reality. In the end, though, the story was still very incomplete, and quickly finished. Arden did not give Sakura much time to rest or take in what had already been given, however, instead pushing knowledge of an entire language, English, into her head, both to better understand the scenes she saw and would see, and because Arden seemed to have a deep and abiding respect for language, one she tried desperately to pass on to the consciousness that she shared a brain with. After that came math, and biology, and chemistry, and psychology, and physics, and even more stories, some historical, others entirely made up, some parabolic, others simply meant to deepen her understanding of all that was possible. Interspersed throughout this was music and sculptures and paintings which danced in and out of focus, as if taunting Sakura to come nearer, to understand more. At last Arden came to what she knew of anatomy, of physiology. Arden was nearly gone. By then, she'd spent as much time as she could giving Sakura information and scant traces of her memory, of times when she felt she succeeded, of times where she knew she failed, but she had yet to give the infant any time to understand any of it, and now there was nothing else left to give. While her anatomical information had started out interspersed with the memories of her learning it, and the feelings associated with various parts, frustration, during a chapter she'd had particular difficulty memorizing. Boredom, during another that she'd already learned in 2 previous situations, gradually began to disappear. By organ systems, because she'd started with the atom before growing in scale, there were no emotions. Sakura had barely been able to start integrating Arden's knowledge of medicine, which was to be shown next, when she was suddenly and forcefully pushed back into awareness and she knew at once Arden was gone. She wailed. Footsteps rushed towards her, and as she allowed them to do what little they could to comfort her, she took in her entirely novel environment, full of white walls instead of lilac, and a small bassinet instead of her mother's bed. There were other babies in the room, too, Sakura thought, and adult people huddled around other beds, but it was hard to see beyond her tears, and so she simply cried, grasping onto the shirt of the man who held her. She did not know how long it took her to fall asleep, but he never put her down, never stopped cooing and talking to her in a language she still didn't understand. When she next woke up she was back in the bassinet, but a familiar voice was singing a lullaby beside her. For the moment she forced her grief over Arden down, and instead turned towards the voice, towards her mother, and reached out, grasping with hands much larger than she remembered. The woman rushed forward and picked her up immediately, cooing and talking just like the man had. She called something behind her, and another man rushed in, different from the first, followed by 2 faces she vaguely remembered as her sister and brother. They all circled around her, gasping and talking and touching, and the man began to cry quietly, holding back the sound in a way she never could. The woman, mother, passed her off to this unknown man, and she did not like that, but he held her the same way mother had and he pressed her ear to his heart and the sound was nice and anyway, hadn't she been awake for long enough? It took at least another week for her consciousness to get a grasp on what was happening, interspersed between liberal amounts of napping and all too many unfamiliar faces looking and touching and talking. Her consciousness's main takeaway was this: she was in the hospital. Apparently, at least as far as she could figure, upon her sudden and inexplicable lack of reaction to anything she'd been shuttled here, and over the course of what she guessed to be over a month based solely on the temperature and Arden's memories of her own seasons, which admittedly wasn't the best source, she was kept under constant observation, the room she was living in being presumably for that exact purpose. She wasn't as bad as some others, of course. About 2/3 of the infants in the room were hooked up to some kind of monitoring system, and nearly all of them were younger than her, but that didn't really stop her mother from acting so relieved every time she opened her eyes, or tried to grab at a finger, or really did anything. All she had was irregular headaches. It was honestly quite nice to be the center of attention, especially because whenever that wasn't the case she tended to be overcome with a sudden gripping fear that it would never be true again. This went away whenever her mother re-entered her vision, but it was still not a pleasant sensation. In other news, she was fairly sure she was a Yamanaka. Her mother was blonde with the same odd eyes as the Ino of Arden's memories, and all of the faces that called her Ka-san, besides the adult man who now appeared almost daily, shared a similar look. The man, quite possibly her father. Actually, she thought she saw him and Ka-san kiss once, was a brunette, but he had the eyes too. So there was that. Mostly, though, Sakura spent very little of the day trying to extrapolate on Arden's information, particularly as that seemed to incite the headaches she so wished to avoid. Most of it was spent trying to interact with the world around her. Spending so long stuck in her own mind made her itch for a change, and so she would squirm and kick and grab and babble, forcing the flood of knowledge to the back of her mind, to be ignored until much, much later. As she gradually grew used to faces other than Ka-san's, she began to truly appreciate that at least one of her siblings, or her father, Tu-san, would spend a little of every day playing with her and bringing her new toys. The small box that held them next to her hospital bassinet was now full to the point of overflowing, and the people would frequently grab a few of the toys, never the ones they had brought, and put them in other babies' baskets so there was room in hers for their own gift. They also seemed to snipe at each other when caught in this practice, which Sakura found hilarious. Beyond that, she had recently figured out how to roll over, which was a blast, if tiring. She was working on sitting up next, less because it was the next milestone according to Arden's memories and more because she wanted to reach the toys on her own, and figured that would be the best way forward. She was also, beginning to figure out some of the words. Manma, she thought, meant food, and she'd taken to trying to scream it when hungry. It was not going well, but at least her caretakers seemed to understand what she was trying to say. She'd also figured out some of her siblings' names. She was fairly sure that she had a genin brother named Ren, and another, slightly younger, brother named Aoi. By the end of the month she was moved out of the hospital, and back to her house, but not to her mother's bed. Instead she found herself sharing a crib with a girl about a year older than her, with two short beds taking up much of the rest of the room, each holding a child each, a girl she would place at about 4, and another who held up 7 fingers when babbling a hello to Sakura. The next major shift in Sakura's life did not come for another 3 months. Over the course of those months she managed to learn how to sit up and crawl and taken to the action with such tenacity that her mother had had to institute a rule about sharp objects after Sakura was found on the floor above her room trying to grab a kunai off her brother Ren's desk. She may have become somewhat of a kleptomaniac. Also she learned how to throw things, so that was cool. Her brother Kamui really hadn't expected to be pelted with grapes, but she'd found it hilarious. Her speech had improved by then, and while none of the sounds she could make really amounted to words, she was able to generally discern what others were saying, so long as they spoke slow enough and she knew what words they were using, so she considered that progress. She'd also managed to figure out her entire family. Ka-san stayed at home, though Sakura was fairly sure she was a shinobi, while Tu-san was frequently on missions, and would disappear for months at a time. He left about a week after she'd been taken home, and had yet to come back. Her oldest brother, 14-year-old Ren, was a genin, as was her 12-year-old sister Sayuri. The next oldest was Aoi, who was 11 and not particularly interested in her, or children, or training, or really anything. Ka-san said it was a phase. Then came the fake twins, her brothers Kaide and Kamui, 9 and 8 respectively but physically identical in nearly every other way. They were followed by a set of real twins, Sakura's sister Akina and brother Arato, who were as different as could be, Akina being far more masculine and Arato preferring typically feminine disciplines. Sakura shared her room with Akina as well as her sister Ayame, who was 5, and Kohana, who was 1. Between them in age was a boy, Fujio, who shared his room with the fake twins and Arato. Ren and Aoi shared a room, and Sayuri had the smallest as her own, but Ren was moving soon. He wanted to live on his own immediately after his chunin promotion, so Ka-san was helping him prepare. And so the first 7 months of Sakura's life passed, excepting the bit she spent unconscious, rather smoothly in the infant's eyes. This was brought to an end by the chunin exams. Ren, as Sakura had already figured out, was going to be participating in them, and that they were taking place in Konoha meant the entire family was heading out in support, which meant her mother was dragging 10 children between the ages of 12 years and 7 months through hordes of onlookers. Thankfully, she had help from the rest of the clan. Unfortunately, most were doing the exact same thing. Eventually, though, they made their way into the stadium. It didn't look the same as the Konoha Stadium that Sakura occasionally got flashes of from Arden's memories. It was smaller, for one, and the majority of the onlookers seemed to be Konoha natives. The competitors, on the whole, also seemed to be slightly younger. Her brother, the 2 genin he was standing next to, and about 5 of the other competitors looked to be about the same age, but the other half were all decidedly younger. It was the younger competitors that were the problem. As Sakura tried to ignore the noise and bustle and screaming around her, she had squinted into the arena to make out the faces that she may have to watch attack Ren in the next few minutes. Most were unrecognizable. 3 weren't. There, about 4 or 5 meters away from Ren, stood Orochimaru, Jiraiya, and Tsunade. Sakura squeaked. "Hush, Sakura-chan," her mother murmured. "It's just a bit of noise. It won't hurt you." Well, actually, Sakura thought, Orochimaru proved pretty indisputably that that wasn't the case. That it had happened in what was now clearly the future was none of her concern. What was more concerning was that she had been trying to block Arden's memories, and yet clearly some had leaked through. Still, it wasn't that bad, so long as it didn't disrupt her day-to-day life. She pushed back her other concerns, her concerns of death and terror and wrong, past her mental barrier. She was not ready for them. The Hokage was speaking now, his face the same as the Hokage of Arden's memories. He was talking about peace, and strength, and other words that remained meaningless. Sakura's head hurt. She didn't want to think of the life-altering children below her, or the danger her brother was in, or the words she couldn't understand, or the noise that encompassed them all. She began to whine and squirm, but her mother shushed her again, running through a few one-handed seals. The world went blissfully silent, and Sakura closed her eyes. She was shaken awake what felt like mere moments later by her siblings jostling. She rubbed her eyes and peered toward the battleground, trying to find out what was exciting them. The scorch marks, wet spots, and overall disrepair of the field was evidence enough that she'd already slept through at least one battle, so she wondered why this one had them so excited. Oh right, her brother. Ren stood with his hair drawn back in the traditional blonde ponytail. He wore purple, the color of their clan, and held kunai in each hand. The girl across from him was clearly an Akamichi, his teammate. If Sakura remembered correctly, she was fairly sure she'd met both of them about a month ago, at Akina and Arato's birthday. If Arden's memories were correct, this wasn't a good matchup. The Akamichi, after all, were known to be frontline fighters, a kind of specialty that worked all too well in this kind of exam. Yamanaka, on the other hand, were known to be great support. Not exactly ideal in this scenario. Her siblings were screaming beside her, but she couldn't hear them. Across from her, on Sayuri's lap, a discomfited Kohana was trying desperately to get off the energetic girl. Ka-san, at least, wasn't outright vibrating in glee, but she was leaning far enough forward that Sakura was compelled to lean with her. She squeezed her eyes shut, but felt a pinch. Letting out a yelp, she whipped around to find Aoi staring straight at her. He pointed to the battlefield, then went back to watching himself. Was she meant to watch? She glanced around at her siblings' faces. Each and every one, from Fujio up anyway, was riveted to the battle, and Kohana's head was also turned to the battle, however unwillingly. She was meant to watch. She wondered why. So she watched. As she expected, it did not take long for the battle to begin going the Akamichi's way. She hadn't ballooned up yet. Perhaps only the future Akamichi could do that. But she was a fearsome opponent anyway, attacking and grappling and doing all she could to put the battle in close quarters. Ren, on the other hand, was doing everything he could to stay away from her. He threw kunai at a mile a minute, sprinting across the field from one side to another as fast as his admittedly short stature would let him. Every once in a while, in a particularly desperate situation, he'd even use a small jutsu to make the ground erupt from under him, giving him an additional boost. But the Akamichi would not be deterred. She'd managed to hit him only twice so far, but each had had their impact. He didn't seem to be capable of moving his left arm very fast, and, according to an increasingly panicked Waika-san, who had rudely removed the silence jutsu so that she could hear the battle, his breathing did not look good. Until, that is, the entire battlefield collapsed. A pit, several meters down, grew startlingly fast from the center of the field, quickly encompassing all but a meter on each side. Ren had clearly been expecting it. The Akamichi had not. She fell with the earth, landing hard at the bottom, and Ren didn't waste any time, immediately beginning a long series of hand signs before pointing straight at the Akamichi. A stream of electricity arced across the air straight at his opponent, and several seconds after he let up and the Akamichi still hadn't moved, the match was called in his favor. Fujio, positioned on the other side of Aoi, began to cry, as did a number of her other siblings. Ka-san was saying something, but Sakura couldn't make it out, too befuddled by the roar of the crowd and her screaming siblings. When her mother pointed at the field, however, she forced herself to look down again. In the middle of the field, surrounded by a couple chunin who were fixing the worst of it, two medics were slowly bringing the Akamichi to her feet, and while she had to lean heavily on both, she was able to make it out of the arena on her own feet. Fujio did not look all that comforted. Sakura was inclined to agree. She buried her face in Ka-san's stomach. She was not looking forward to seeing children fight, and neither of the next two contestants could be older than 8, so she closed her eyes until it was her brother's turn again. Ren lost his next battle to Jiraiya and, like the Akamichi, was promptly whisked away with too many injuries to feel good about. The family, to Sakura's disappointment, stayed until the end, when a ferocious battle between the 6 or 7-year-old Jiraiya and Orochimaru, another that had seen her silence taken away, found the latter the victor. Sakura fell asleep for good soon after, and only awoke the next day to Ren jostling her awake and shoving green fabric in her face, the chunin vest, before doing the same to Kohana. She guessed he got promoted then. Besides the excitement of the exams, however, and the hard work she had had to do to shove Arden's related memories away, the rest of the year to her birthday passed relatively sedately. Ren moved out, of course, and mother found herself pregnant again. Aoi now shared a room with the fake twins, while Arato now only shared with Fujio. Sayuri was also made to share with Akina, who had complained about being stuck in the baby's room even more than Arato. Sakura herself grew by leaps and bounds. She was now able to crawl onto any of the shorter seats in the house, and could even walk if she was careful to have a handhold within reach. She'd also managed to figure out how to eat both finger foods and spoon foods by herself, which she was quite proud of. She'd started calling Ka-san Mama, like Kohana did, because it was much easier to pronounce, and she could generally get out the first syllable of everyone else's name. She could also ask for food, cuddles, and help with something. She could also say no, a power which she used liberally. Kohana, too, was improving substantially. While her understood vocabulary was about the same as Sakura's own, she was able to talk more than Sakura could currently hope for, even if none of it could yet be considered sentences. Most importantly, all this improvement meant she got her own bed, which doubled the space Sakura was able to occupy and meant she didn't have to deal with bumpy elbows in her sleep anymore. Sakura was fairly sure she was more excited about Kohana's bed than Kohana. Beyond that, Ayame, Kamui, and Ren's birthdays, both Sayuri's and Kaide's, taking place exactly 1 week after her own, proved great opportunities for meeting new Yamanaka, Akamichi, and Nara, which made it all too clear that Arden had been right about what world she'd been born in, even if not one face beyond. Of course, those all too fleetingly seen in the chunin exams matched a memory. The falling of the cherry blossoms marked a year past, and Sakura breathed in their smell willingly, her mind undeveloped enough that she could not truly understand the impact of what she knew. Sakura's development began to skyrocket shortly after her birthday. Continued practice finally enabled her to communicate, and immediately after she began to talk non-stop, a not uncommon reaction in the Yamanaka family, apparently. Before long, she'd overtaken Kohana in ability, easily managing to string together 3 or 4 words even if the grammar was more than a little questionable. She'd also taken to exploring, or running away, depending on who you asked, and had quickly met all her family's immediate neighbors and tried to make friends with every person, animal, and plant she encountered. In the midst of that goal, she'd found a tree swing built for someone her age, and now spent a good chunk of every day trying to convince one of her older siblings to take her to swing on it. She had also crawled out of her crib enough that her own bed was placed right where it used to be. This led to a rather sharp change in how she was treated, one that Kohana felt at the same time. Their days were no longer solely about playing for hours on end. Instead, Ka-san would teach them how to catch and throw balls, would have them race each other in the field behind their house, and would teach them hand signs, even if she clearly didn't expect them to be able to perform them anytime soon. Both were also trained to use the bathroom alongside each other and were no longer allowed to call out in the middle of the night unless it was an emergency. Ka-san said their siblings, who were in charge of the nighttime check-ins, needed sleep too. Their grammar was also corrected, nearly constantly, and they were expected to ask for something before they could get it, no matter what it was. It was as if every moment of their day had suddenly and inexplicably become more difficult, not hard, necessarily, but trying. In this, Sakura and Kohana quickly found themselves bonding. Kohana would frequently slip into Sakura's bed when she woke up scared, and Sakura would always bring whatever shiny new object she found to Kohana for identification purposes. Her mother, for some reason, always seemed more concerned about where she got it than what its name was. Their sharp difference in size did not seem to bother Kohana, so Sakura did not let it bother her. It did, however, bother Fujio quite a bit. At 3 he was noticeably taller, more coordinated, and more coherent than either of them, but as they both continued forward on the developmental chain, they began taking part more and more in Fujio's lessons, while his former partner, the 5-year-old Ayame, was being prepared to be sent to school in a few months with a few of their other clansmen. Fujio didn't like this. He would frequently steal both of their toys and was very upset over his time with Ka-san being taken away, especially given how close the new baby was to arriving. Ka-san disciplined him, of course, and Fujio would always say sorry, and to a large extent mean it, but Sakura could see that their rapid development also scared him. Ka-san talked to him each time he did something mean, though, so Sakura did not let it bother her. And anyway, Kohana was much more interesting. When Sakura was 14 months old, the baby was born. Ka-san went to the hospital to have her 6th daughter, Hamari, and didn't leave for 4 months. Instead, the 10 siblings who still lived at home moved in with their Aunt Hina, and beds were doubled and tripled up to make room for everyone. Sakura cried a lot. Arden's passed on memories and awareness helped some, giving her more experience in coping, plus she'd been told that her mother would come back when she could, and that Sakura knew she'd met her aunt before and liked her, but it was hard in a way that was difficult to explain. Ka-san was Sakura's anchor, and her anchor was gone. The middle of summer brought the next semester of the academy, and with it some changes. First, Sayuri moved out. She was 13, she proclaimed, and she and her friend Narayua were perfectly capable of affording an apartment between them. Sakura thought it had more to do with how she now not only shared her room with Akina, but also Aunt Hina's 2 oldest daughters, one of which had a massive crush on Sayuri's boyfriend, and the other who hated the cramped living conditions almost as much as Sayuri herself. Second, Aoi dropped out of the academy. Something felt wrong about that, especially given that he'd shown no uncertainty about becoming a shinobi before, but she and the rest of her siblings were warned not to question it. Instead, he became an apprentice to a merchant, and that was that. He also moved out, theoretically to be closer to his work. Kaide, Kamui, Akina, and Arato stayed in the academy, though, and Ayame was old enough to join them. Only Kamui was thinking of quitting, and Ka-san apparently asked him to tough it out for one more semester before making his decision. In terms of those left at home throughout the day, Fujio's behavior had deteriorated rapidly enough that they put him with the upcoming academy students in the hope that his poor showing would either cause him to mellow out or force him to work hard enough to keep up. Kohana and Sakura, on the other hand, were taught alongside Aunt Hina's youngest, a set of twin boys who, while jealous, did not see the same decline in behavior that Fujio had. Life went on. It wasn't until September that Ka-san returned home, holding a 4-month-old bundle named Hamari as she did. Tu-san was beside her, and while he was nearly unrecognizable to Sakura and Kohana, the older children greeted him quite amicably. The entire family had soon made their beds in their own house once more, except for the 3 oldest, of course, but they still made a regular point of visiting. That night each child clamored to tell both Ka and Tu-san their life stories, and Sakura smiled as she watched her parents laugh and try to get only one of them to speak at a time. She enjoyed hearing about Ren's plumbing issues and his new girlfriend, the daughter of the plumber, surprisingly enough. She giggled at Sayuri's drawn-out explanation over her breakup with Yuma Inuzuka and how she couldn't believe she dated him in the first place. While Aoi remained quiet, Sakura still appreciated seeing him, and her parents clearly felt the same. They obviously knew what was going on, even if Sakura didn't. Kaide begged for help studying for academy finals, and Kamui talked about an Akimichi restaurant willing to offer him an apprenticeship. Akina moaned about having to take kunoichi classes, and Arato moaned about not being allowed to take them. Boys had their own classes instead, but they didn't cover the same material. Ayame moaned about everything and everything, but mostly about how school was boring and her classmates sucked. Ka-san clicked her tongue at that, and Tu-san warned her that her opinions would probably change in the coming years. Fujio, surprisingly, was in a fantastic mood and described in great detail all he was learning from Uncle Haruto, and how Uncle Haruto thought he may be able to enter that winter if Tu-san and Ka-san agreed. They said they'd think about it. Finally, it was Kohana and Sakura's turn, and they went back and forth explaining every little thing they'd said and done over the past few months, and then I saw a caterpillar, and I found a centipede the next day, which, by the end of it, had them dubbed, Fake Twins version 2 feet. More to do with personality than looks in your case, I'd say. Tu-san had laughed. After all, the first set of fake twins, Kaide and Kamui, may have looked identical, but below the surface they were as different as could be. The next day, after Kohana's and Sakura's wake-up time at 8, a time that would slowly decrease to 5:30 as they neared academy age even if their bedtime, 2000, remained the same, Tu-san took the 2 of them out to a field to test their progress. Alright, girls. Now, I know your mother is a bit better at fighting than me, but I'm not without my uses. Today we're going to go over all the physical basics you'll be expected to know before you enter the academy. Don't worry, though, there's no rush, I just thought you'd like an overview. That was unexpected. Sakura was pretty sure that Fujio hadn't been given this opportunity. Tu-san first went over all the muscle groups, most of which was review from Arden's memories, but with different names. He then went over their physical fitness requirements. They were to be able to sprint at a minimum speed 25 times in a row and run a mile at a slightly slower speed, though Tu-san did not mention what the speeds were, and they were to be able to complete at least 15 curl-ups, push-ups, and other stretches each. Tu-san showed them all, but only named a few, and Arden's memories did not include most of them, and proved they could hang off a rail for a certain length of time. Beyond that, Yamanaka standards also emphasize the ability to perform a number of acrobatic feats, including tumbles and handstands, as well as being able to imitate the beginning kata of the clan technique and successfully form the shapes for each hand sign when presented with them, and hit the target at least 1 out of 10 times with both a kunai and shuriken. While Sakura did not know why her father was showing her and Kohana all of this, its immediate effect was exciting the two girls as much as the pre-academy lessons had Fujio. They spent the rest of the time they were supposed to spend training imitating Tusan to the best of their ability, and allowing him to pick them up and kiss their bruises when they failed. After that, however, another modification came, this one to their schedule. Generally, training time was from 9 to 11:30 every day, followed by an hour of lunch and play and a half hour of cleaning. At around 1, they would be taught manners for about half an hour. Followed by nap time, then half an hour of family history, which was really just memorizing from a scroll that held the Yamanaka family tree, followed by another hour of play, followed by a half hour of math, followed by more play, followed by half an hour to an hour of reading. Her older siblings were put in charge of this portion, and varied wildly in how much time and effort they were willing to put in, followed by play until dinner, getting ready for bed, and being put to sleep. Apparently, this was all to change. After a longer than usual family history class, when Kohana and Sakura turned to rush out as usual, their mother's hands on their shoulders stilled them. Instead, they were led back into their seats, and their math lesson began immediately. After another longer than usual math class, when Sakura's eyes began to droop and Kohana's weren't doing much better, they were finally allowed time to play. As she and Kohana built a world out of sticks where each clan actually consisted of the animal they felt represented them, the Nara deer, Yamanaka crane, Akamichi cow, Senju monkey, and Uchiha cat among them, Sakura tried to figure out why they seemed to be being pushed faster now. As far as she knew, there was no war going on, and her parents had not seemed to mind Kamui's plan to drop out at the end of the semester too much, so why was her and Kohana's workload suddenly increasing? After an hour their play was interrupted again, this time for a new session about plants, which they hadn't even touched on yet. By the end of that lesson, it was dinner time, and Sakura put her musings aside for the night. By the end of the following week, though, it was all too clear what her parents were doing. Her development, in the months before and the month following her first birthday, had been almost miraculously fast as she picked up and used every piece of knowledge anyone gave her, gratefully pushing Arden's overwhelming amount of information back with bits and pieces actually relevant in her day-to-day life. Once she started to be taught with Kohana, however, she faltered, and her development eventually slowed to match her sister's. Why would Sakura keep trying hard, after all, when she could maintain the same level of learning and gain a best friend along the way? It hadn't been a conscious decision, a planned-out process that started with purposefully flubbing a run and ended with her intentionally dumbing down her grammar to the point of near incomprehensibility, but the end result was the same. And somehow her parents had figured it out. So, the increase in training, the increasingly short amount of time in the day solely for play. That was for her benefit, not Kohana's. As the week passed, Kohana began to fall behind more and more, finding it difficult to try to up and therefore not bothering to try in the first place. Sakura, though, was unable to hide her understanding of the material for too long, and soon the gap between the two girls began to grow. By the time the last leaves had fallen from the tree, Kohana and Sakura's lessons had separated entirely, with Kohana's mimicking what they'd had before their parents came back and being taught by Tusan, while Sakura took one-on-one, with baby Hamari providing much-needed breaks, lessons with Ka-san. Upset with this shift, and desperate to find something to comfort her, Sakura turned to Arden's memories as relief. In the past 20 months, her entire lifetime, Sakura had not once deliberately touched the mass of information that had been foisted upon her. Some of it leaked out, both in the initial flood and over time, bones and muscles and how they worked one day, a picture of a smiling red-headed girl the next, then how to measure slope, then the legendary Sanin, and so on, but she had to a certain extent been able to shield herself from the majority of it and seal whatever did come out back in whenever she could. When it did leak, She got headaches, something that was both painful and very worrying for her parents, so Sakura constantly worked to minimize the leaks as much as possible. It was just such a daunting project, the lifetime of memories. Arden, she knew, had been 20 when she died. The difference between 20 months and 20 years of memories was substantial, and Sakura did not trust herself capable of dealing with the mountain when she was already having problems with the molehill. But desperate times called for desperate measures, and when Sakura was told to be awake at 7:30 while Kohana was allowed to stay asleep until 8:30. Those were desperate times. She needed more understanding of the situation than what her current mind was capable of, so it was time to see what the remnants of Arden's could do. Carefully, achingly slowly, she let down her mind's barriers. Sakura stifled a scream. She probably should have planned this out better, so she wasn't inexplicably freaking out in the middle of her afternoon nap, not technically scheduled anymore, but always taking place during a playtime regardless. Her mother rushed towards her, picking her up and asking what was wrong as Himari cried for the rest of her feeding in the corner. Tears pricked Sakura's eyes. It was too much, and she didn't know how to explain, how to stop this flood of information and thoughts and feelings from taking over, and it was too much. Why isn't it stopping? Why won't it stop? Why? How had she forgotten that Arden had removed all physical sensations when she did this? How did she think this was a good idea? And no matter what she did, it wouldn't stop, wouldn't even slow down. Sakura opened her eyes to a white ceiling. She shifted, turning sideways. She was back in the hospital, but in a new room, one with cribs for older children. Through the walls of her cage she could see her parents and a doctor, the same one as last time, talking, though she couldn't make out any words. Sayuri was passed out in a chair beside the crib, with one hand hanging limply inside, and some of Sakura's favorite toys were scattered around the small mattress. Sakura hoped she'd not gone into a coma again. She was fairly sure that was what had happened last time, but it didn't look like she had. Sayuri looked the same, at least. "Hi Sayuri," Sakura mumbled. It was hard for her to talk, her exhaustion making any movement an effort, but she was happy she'd spoken when her sister jerked awake and grabbed her in a sweeping movement, snuggling her to her chest. "Oh, Sakura, why are you always unwell?" she mumbled. Her movement had caught their parents and the doctor's attention, and now they huddled over Sakura while the doctor checked her reflexes and shone a light in her eye. "She looks fine now, exhausted, perhaps, but otherwise fine." "Sakura, sweetheart, can you tell us what happened?" "Too much," Sakura said. The doctor was talking very loudly, so she didn't really want to answer, but maybe if she did, he would leave, and she could snuggle and sleep again. "What was too much?" the doctor asked. "Everything." She fell asleep before he had time to respond. When she woke again, it was to an argument between her doctor and her parents. Sayuri was gone, but Kaide was there, resolutely ignoring the raised voices and instead trying to read through a textbook. "The best option. You keep saying that like you have any proof. Do you understand what you're asking us to do?" That was Ka-san's shouting. "I understand your worry, but that must be the doctor." Our worry. In one breath you are telling us that chakra sensing put her into this mess, and in the next you are saying you want to force her to sense chakra. The problem, the doctor sighed, Sakura was fairly sure this wasn't his first time explaining this, is that your daughter keeps on accidentally triggering her chakra sense at an age where she has no capacity to deal with it, realizing she is unable to cope with the new sensations, and forcing it to shut down through a coma. This is not a healthy way of dealing with it, and if we can force her chakra sense to turn on without allowing her to force it off by blacking out, then your daughter will be able to figure out how to cope with it, and turn it off in a less worrying way. Can't you just turn it permanently off?" Ka-san asked. "Make her never have to deal with the pain." "If I could, I would," the doctor said. "But that would be shutting off part of her chakra, which always comes with incredibly severe side effects. This really is the best way forward, the one which will see Sakura in the least pain overall. Not to mention, It would be best to do this now. Children as young as she is usually lose most of their memories from this age, which would improve the chances that she doesn't remember this incident at all. She's a child genius, Sakura's father muttered. I think she'll remember it. They left the room. Sakura stared at the ceiling. Her crib didn't have a mobile, but both of the ones bordering hers did, and she flicked her eyes back and forth, trying to decide if she liked the abstract one with simple painted metal shapes or the one with a half-dozen wooden animals better. Kaide began to snore. Sakura didn't think he was reading the textbook anymore. She carefully sat up. She felt fine, though the tube connected to her right arm was slightly uncomfortable. She thought about pulling it out but decided not to. Instead, she turned to her stuffed caterpillar dog. She'd found it funny, at least, and made it march across the crib edge. I a hungry caterpillar and I eat. She looked at the rest of her toys before grabbing her stuffed monkey, Carrot. I eat Carrot. She mashed her two toys together and laughed. Then Carrot try eat me. They're trying to eat each other. Kaide asked. Oops. It looks like she woke him up. Oh well, at least this way they could play. You be Carrot, she said, thrusting the monkey at him. I be dog. Kaide blinked at her. Sakura couldn't quite remember if he'd been introduced to her odd style of naming before, but she couldn't bring herself to care. It was time for dog to get his meal. I a hungry caterpillar. Sakura shouted and attacked. Kaide huffed affectionately, but dutifully held the monkey as if he was fighting back. The next time she woke up, Sakura wasn't hooked up to anything but she was in a different room and Ka-san was holding her and crying. Sakura peered around the small room as the adults continued to speak. How long will this take? Her father asked. We don't really know, the doctor said. Is this really where it's? Her mother stuttered. We're in a training field that's known for low chakra content, the doctor explained. It would be best not to overwhelm her. The room was plain, 6 sides of white, with a door on one breaking up the monotony and an odd table in the middle, with boxes stored underneath. Against her will, Sakura was lifted from her mother and placed on the table by the doctor, before he pulled something out from beneath the table, an odd blanket. Sakura's mother gasped, but Sakura couldn't figure out what it was. She thought that Arden might know, but she also really didn't want to try to use the memories again, so she just stared at it curiously as the doctor wrapped it around her. That is, she stared at it curiously until he actually began to strap it into place. She squirmed, annoyed, as all possible movement for her arms and legs were restricted, and began to whine as a different odd series of straps held her head in place. Oh, I know, honey, her mother cooed. I know. It'll all be over soon, her father added. The doctor made a skeptical noise which did little to comfort Sakura. Her father eyed him angrily. We'll be with you the whole time. All right, the doctor said. Sakura noticed for the first time that he was a Yamanaka, though the straight blonde hair and odd Yamanaka eyes should have been a giveaway. I'm going to partially open her first gate, so she can't fall unconscious, and then I'll unlock her natural sensory ability. Sakura had not stopped crying. Let's begin. The doctor touched her head with 2 fingers and closed his eyes in concentration. Sakura yelped as a prickling sensation began to invade her brain, and as much as she tried to shuffle away from it she couldn't move at all. Another sensation, this one more searing, took over, but it disappeared quickly as a sudden rush of something made every part of her body feel stuffed, as if it were about to explode. She scrunched her eyes shut and began to scream, barely feeling as the doctor took his fingers off and reapplied them to the base of her neck, absorbed as she was with needing to release the pent-up energy inside her, and having no way to do it. Then, when Sakura tried to access Arden's memories, it felt as if she was holding a piece of paper with a hole she wanted the water to exit through against a faucet of information. It was a lot, it was too much, but the water was already compressed, limited in the amount it could shove in her brain even before her attempts to stymie the flow. This felt more like holding that same paper against an ocean. Her screaming became shrill, and did not stop until her voice was gone, and even then she still tried to make noise, tried to convey how much this hurt, tried to get it to end because it was too much, too much, too much, too much, too much, too much, why, too much, why, too much, why, too much, stop, 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 too much, stop, why, stop, too much, why, stop, please, please, stop, too much, why. The sensation ended. We'll continue tomorrow, a man's voice said, and then she was unconscious. It took a while, after she was born, for Sakura to get a sense of time. When she finally had it, a significant portion of her energy was spent protecting that knowledge, and using it whenever possible. The ability to tell time, to tell how long something takes, when something will be, what the daily schedule is like, was one that Sakura found infinitely useful, and therefore carried close to her chest as one of her crowning achievements, because getting that far had in no way been easy, especially given the difficulty of even counting up to 24. That achievement was gone. Sakura had no idea how much time passed between that first miserable day and the next time she regained consciousness. All she knew was the pain interspersed in between. She didn't remember being fed, or changed, or bathed. She didn't remember where she was, or who she was with, or why she was there. The pain, the all-consuming pain, took up her entire attention and left time for nothing else, not even time itself. As this went on, though, the pain slowly began to lessen. Slowly the overwhelming amount of sensation at every side began to dissipate as she formed walls against its torrential power, and many of the signals constantly being sent to her brain began to go away. The longer she spent in pain, the more conditioned she became to the sensations, until at last it was only the three things that actually moved and changed around her that still caused her head to feel as if it was being carved in half, and even that was slowly dissipating, slowly being blocked by her new mental wall. There was a man's voice, humming, she noticed one time. The next time she was coherent she felt a hand rubbing her brow, cleaning the sweat from it. As she slowly returned to awareness she also began to scream less, her blood curdling, if entirely silent, muted by overuse cries eventually becoming full-body heaves, then whimpering, then simple tears. "Oh, Sakura," her mother said the first time she stopped crying. The man, the evil man, had stopped the sensations for a little while, and the end of the misery allowed her to finally take in her parents' faces. They weren't doing well. Her mother's long blonde hair looked as if it didn't know what a brush was, and her eyes were so bloodshot they were nearly red. Her clothes, too, were the same as Sakura remembered her wearing last time, but she was pretty sure that wasn't just because it was the same day. Beside her mother stood her father, whose clean-shaven face now sported stubble and whose generally cropped brown hair now danced along the tips of his ears. His hand was on her foot, she noticed, and her mother's was cupping her head, shaved bald, apparently. She wondered when that happened. "Mama. Chi-Chi." Sakura got out. "Sakura," her father moaned. "It is time to start again," the evil man in the corner said, and her mother began to cry. However long it took for her to become used to the constant sensory overload, it did happen, and to her surprise Sakura found herself, with her sensing thankfully off, her walls firmly up, being led out of the building shortly after the first time she made it through a session without any tears at all. "We'll need regular appointments," the doctor was saying, "but I'll suggest one of my colleagues for that. I fear her memories of me won't be very pleasant. I'd also suggest letting her take it easy for the next 3 or so months, say until her 3rd birthday. Let her recover and try not to strain her in any way at first, then slowly begin working up to what you had her doing before this happened. You have to remember that she didn't open her chakra sense because it was too much, the two were likely completely unconnected." Mama and Chi-Chi made the appropriate noises, but it was clear they were barely listening. Sakura hoped the evil man was writing down whatever it was if it was important. She didn't want him to have a single excuse to see her ever again. By the time they made it home it was well past dark, and most of her siblings were fast asleep. After a short bath, she was carefully put in her own bed and tucked in. "Sleep well, little Sakura," her mother said. Her father kissed her forehead, and they lingered at the door before abruptly disappearing. Sakura sighed and closed her eyes. Perhaps now she could get a good night's rest. For the most part, the rest of Sakura's second year of life went rather calmly. Ren and his new girlfriend moved in together. Sayuri got a field promotion after her team caught 3 chunin at the same time. Aoi left on a trip. Kaide made genin. Kamui started his apprenticeship at the restaurant. Akina and Arato managed to successfully pretend to be each other for nearly 3 months during gender-specific lessons with no one noticing. Fujio entered the academy, and Kohana really missed her. As for Sakura, she kept a tight lid on Arden's Pandora box of information, as well as her own similar box of chakra sense, and took it easy. In fact, for the first month she didn't even have to worry about lessons. It was only as she began to find the energy to do things that she was explicitly sold not to do that lessons once more made their way into her schedule. Still, life was good. And her birthday. That was great. For her birthday, the Akamichi members in attendance made sure to gift her every food she could ever want, all the sweet, salty, and just generally bad for you treats that she was so rarely allowed to consume. It seemed as if everyone she knew was there too, mixing and mingling and wishing her happy birthday and smiling indulgently and playing games, and Sakura spent the day absolutely giddy, so high on life that she didn't even care about what abandoning a game with a Nara mid-turn due to boredom looked like. It had been a while since she'd felt that good. She didn't explore much anymore, didn't talk as much as she'd used to, but the good food and smiling faces and good music made it hard to feel anything but happy. She'd already had to participate in similar events in the previous months for Kohana and Kamui and Ayame and, in the coming week, would have Sayuri's and Kaide's birthday to celebrate, followed by little Hamari's 2 months later. But parties were a part of life, and this one was all about her, which meant that it was her favorite food on the table and she didn't have to be polite and let elderly aunties squeeze her cheeks all night, only once at the beginning. She already knew she'd be bored at Sayuri's and Kaide's party, given that she had no doubt it would all be about shinobi things she wasn't yet allowed to know, so she might as well live it up now. For all the good, the party also brought an unwelcomed revelation. It was the first time she truly understood the connections between the Akamichi, Yamanaka, and Nara. For one, the non-Yamanaka adults, 2 Akamichi couples and 2 Yamanaka couples, each had one spouse on one of Sakura's parents' genin teams. For another, each of her siblings seemed to follow this pattern. Ren's girlfriend was another Yamanaka, Iku, but his teammates were a Nara girl and an Akamichi boy respectively. Sayuri's contained an Akamichi but a civilian took the place of the Nara, and while Aoi didn't have a team to bring, and did not, in fact, come at all, Kaide's new one was outfitted with the stereotypical Akamichi and Nara teammates. Sakura could even see the pattern being maintained for those not yet graduated. Akina was hanging out with 2 boys, a Nara and an Akamichi, while Arato was hanging around the Nara's brother and an Akamichi girl. Ayame, too, held firm to the pattern, as did Fujio, all of them, intentionally or unintentionally, maintaining the Ino-Shika-Cho combination. This made what her parents did when it came time to eat more than a little telling. Just as she was beginning to feel hungry, Sakura was lifted up, swung around until she couldn't stop laughing, then plopped between a 3-year-old Nara, Shin, and a 4-year-old Akamichi, Jiro. Get to know each other, her mother smiled. And be polite. The Nara did not say a single word. The Akamichi couldn't, with how much he was stuffing his face. Sakura didn't really think she needed more friends, she already had Kohana. She wondered why they were all different ages. She pushed the thought out of her head, recognizing her brain's realization that it was something her consciousness did not want to know. She ate cake. In the months following her birthday, Sakura quickly fell into a routine. While her parents were weary of pushing her as far as they had the last time, the longer she went without incident, the more they tried to see if she could handle it. By the start of the new academy year that summer, she was up every day at 7 and followed a rigorous schedule until dinner. A half hour of very basic chakra lessons, followed by equally basic survival lessons, followed by practice memorizing weaponry and throwing balls, followed by exercise, followed by kata training, followed by simple math, followed by her lessons on plants, followed by family history, followed by etiquette. Somewhere in there her lunch, playtime, cleaning time, and afternoon nap would be slipped in, and before she knew it, it was time for the bustle of dinner. It hurt, sometimes, her lessons. They weren't bad. Really, actually, she found the information riveting, even if it had taken much too long to understand how a taller, skinnier glass filled with water held as much as a shorter, wider one. The problem was more the loneliness of the schedule. She only saw Kohana for an hour of playtime, now, her only hour, and the third of Kohana's that day. The rest of the day, however, she had no company but Ka-san, who had to split her time between Sakura, Kohana, 2-san having left Hamari, and daily chores, making her less than ideal company. Sakura started to kind of understand where Fujio was going with this whole jealousy thing. That didn't mean it was all bad, though. Now that she could clean her own teeth and only needed a bath every other day, she got to have reading time with Ayame after dinner while Ka-san finished helping Kohana and Hamari. While the 6-year-old's reading wasn't ideal, it was still reading, and Ayame also had a habit of dragging her finger along the words she was reading, which made it easier to follow and try to make out the symbols. In this way the summer and fall passed uneventfully, with, perhaps, the exception of Shin and Jiro being pushed on her for an hour at least once every other week. They still hadn't spoken much beyond social niceties, but it was good to have an extended nap, so Sakura wouldn't complain too much. January, however, brought another Yamanaka party. More specifically, the 15th of January brought the 6th month of the Nara heir's life. He, as well as the Akamichi heir, born shortly after Sakura's own birthday, and the Yamanaka heir, born January 24th, which she really didn't recall, would be the next Inoshika-cho trio, and in celebration, as well as an early birthday party for the oldest, all three clans held a large gathering at the Yamanaka's main house. Sakura's family was invited. It would be her first time in the main house, and it was also Akina's, Arato's, Ayame's, Fujio's, Kohana's, and Hamari's first time too. Ka-san may have been panicking. It'll be alright. Chichi, who had reappeared only a week ago, laughed, half exasperated and half amused as he helped Kamui fix his outfit. It will not be alright. We are expected there in 15 minutes, and we still need to switch Akina and Arato out of each other's clothes and get Kohana to stop picking at her ponytail. I don't want to wear my kimono. Akina griped. It's too girly. Arato likes girly stuff anyway. I don't see what the big deal is. And, as I've told you before, Akina, I don't care what you wear day to day, but at formal events you will dress properly, and that's final. Kenta, help them switch. Chichi. Kenta sighed and dusted Kamui's shoulders one last time before turning to a pouting Arato. Sakura had a feeling that Kamui's outfit had been fine for at least the last 3 or so minutes, but that her father had simply not wanted to get involved into the argument until he absolutely had to. In other news, Kohana's ponytail was now completely disassembled. Sakura was jealous. Kohana, what did you do to your hair? Ka-san cried. I'll fix it, Ka-san, Sayuri said. She was going to be attending as part of the family for the ceremony, but Ren wouldn't be, instead choosing to escort his girlfriend Iku and her elderly grandmother on his own. Thank you, Sayuri, Mama sighed. Alright, is everyone ready? Sakura looked around. Out of those attending, which unfortunately did not include Aoi, how long had it been since she'd seen him? Sayuri was, of course, perfectly made up, and while Kaide's was a bit off, Kamui's obi had been knotted to perfection. Akina and Arato were in the right kimonos, and Ayame and Fujio had each fallen asleep on each other against the wall. Sakura knew that she herself was prepared, having been made up last, and the baby didn't really need to be all that dressed up, being only one, so that left Kohana. It hurts. You'll get used to it. And that was everybody. Remember proper etiquette. Ka-san cried, and they were out the door. As they walked up the hill, Chichi began to describe the main Yamanaka house. It was at least 3 times the size of any of its neighbors and held not only the current head of the family's family but also any who could not live on their own, be they elderly, orphaned, or ill. The eastern part of the main house also held a number of offices for Yamanaka matters, but, her father explained, they generally went unused, being positioned as they were directly next to the very noisy Yamanaka training grounds. Now, Ka-san interrupted, I need all of you to remember to be on your best behavior, and to congratulate Inoto-san for his healthy baby boy, whose name is Inoichi. I mentioned that, right? I'm fairly sure I mentioned that. Anyway, the Akamichi heir is Choza and the Nara heir is Shikaku. That shouldn't be too hard to remember. After all, they were named after Ino Shikacho, so just try to remember to congratulate. Oh, we're here. They entered and began the long-standing tradition of too many social niceties for any reasonable person to endure. Sakura, perhaps spitefully, intentionally did not congratulate Inoto on his soon-to-be 1-year-old son. The clan head did not seem to mind, but then he seemed to be more on autopilot than actually listening to anything that was said. Sakura wondered if there'd be any sweets. Come on, Kohana said, appearing from out of nowhere. I want to meet your teammates. Teammates? Sakura asked. You know, Kohana whined. Shin and Juro. So, it seemed her policy of ignorance hadn't worked. How unfortunate. Eventually, she and Kohana had weaved through the crowd far enough to reach Juro, whose extremely large father had been easy to pick out of a crowd, even with the two's less than optimal perspective. Hi, Kohana started, completely disregarding all the etiquette her mother had so thoughtfully made her memorize once a day, 7 days a week. My name's Kohana. Yours is Juro. Did you know that the camellia flower is not only used in teas, but also in cosmetics? No, Juro said. Go, play, his mother said. She seemed distracted. I need to find your brother Hachiro. Hachiro? Sakura asked, against her permission. Dad's not very creative with names, Juro explained. Kazuro, Jiro, Zoro, Shiro, Guro, first son, second, third, fourth, fifth, I'm the 10th, and the youngest. Kohana curled her lip. Didn't your mom come up with any baby names? She asked. She and Dad made a deal that she'd name the girls and he'd name the boys. The problem is they only had sons, so she never got to name anybody. And anyway, Dad swears up and down that we have good names. I guess they're not awful, Sakura said, trying to be polite. We're all named after flowers, Kohana said. That's much better than just birth order. Juro shrugged. Anyway, do you know where Shin is? I want to meet all of Sakura-chan's future teammates. I haven't seen any of you since her birthday. Without missing a beat, Juro shrugged again. Dunno. We've just arrived ourselves. That's why Mom's so worried about my 8th oldest brother, Hachiro. He shouldn't have disappeared so quickly. Why didn't he seem surprised about Kohana thinking they were a future team? They were all different ages. Who knew if they'd even get along as ninja? And it wasn't like Kohana had any obvious future team, so why did Sakura have to have one? Come on, Kohana whined. Sakura realized her sister was trying to pull her forward. This place is really big and we need to start looking immediately. While they never did end up finding Shin, Kohana's incessant efforts to find my best sister's future teammates seemed to endear everyone they met. More worryingly, not one seemed surprised at the proclamation. Eventually, though, Kohana began to exhaust herself and went to find Mama while Sakura turned back to her original goal, food. Just as she'd spotted a table of finger snacks and noticed that the only ones in her reach were annoyingly healthy, a conversation to her left caught her attention. More specifically, the voice of Sakura's oldest sister made the topic more interesting than carrots, but then that was a pretty low bar. She won't even talk to me. Sayuri whined to the girl next to her. I mean, yes, I probably shouldn't have made out with her brother, but he was so cute. But now you is threatening to kick me out and we've been best friends since our first year at the academy. I mean, the Yamanaka next to her responded, she did catch you with his tongue down your throat and your hand down his. Hush. You never know who's listening, Sayuri said, slapping her hand over the other girl's mouth and whipping around to see if anyone had, indeed, caught their conversation. Sakura blinked at her. Sayuri did not look thrilled at the attention. You didn't hear that, did you? What did you have your hand down? Sayuri asked. She wondered if she'd put it down the hole at the bottom of the toilet. Kohana did that last week, to see where it led, and Ka-san had gotten really upset. Nothing. I didn't put my hand down anything. Sakura opened her mouth to point out that the other Yamanaka had, in fact, sounded fairly certain about the events, but Sayuri groaned before she could get a word out. How about this? I give you 3 pieces of dango, and you tell no one anything about what you heard. Sakura thought about it. She didn't understand what the big deal was, but it was obvious Sayuri really cared about her answer. 5 pieces. 4. 5, or no deal. Fine. Sayuri groaned. She stomped over to the appetizer table and grabbed the requisite pieces off one of the higher-tiered plates. Nice. The other Yamanaka girl nodded at Sakura. But next time remember you could go for higher. I'm pretty sure you could have gone up to 8 before Sayuri would have even tried to argue back. Sakura nodded in return, filing that information, as well as the side-eye Sayuri gave her companion for giving it, in her mind for later evaluation. Well, you didn't agree at 8, you agreed at 5. And you better honor your promise. Sayuri snapped. Sakura hummed happily around a mouth full of dango. I have no idea what you're talking about, she mumbled. This dango fell out of thin air. Good, Sayuri said. Now, shoo. Sakura shooed. About 5 minutes later she came upon the very trio the party was about. They had been sat in the middle of a room, and a photographer had been hired to take a picture of them, so their parents were trying very hard to get them to sit still and have their eyes open long enough for a good photograph to be taken. It wasn't going well. Behind the adults Sakura began making faces, a surefire way to get her little sister to laugh, and while Shikaku couldn't care less and Choza still looked like he was about to cry, Inoichi began crawling towards her. The adults thought he was trying to crawl to his mother, and Sakura disappeared before they noticed her. The airs were even more boring than Hamari. Shortly after running from one end of the estate to the other, twice, however, she began to experience the dreaded sugar crash. She decided to look for a blanket, and a place to nap. She'd barely found the first, however, when large hands wrapped around her, picking her up and putting her against their hip. Hi Chi-Chi. Hello my favorite blossom, Tu-san replied. He said that to all of his kids, but it still made Sakura happy whenever he said it to her. Shouldn't you be with Jiro and Shin? Why? Sakura asked. No one had told her that she was supposed to be with them. Well, they're your friends, aren't they? Chi-Chi asked. Sakura didn't know about that. They'd never played together, after all, only slept. But she guessed this particular friendship wasn't up to her, so she nodded in agreement when Tu-san offered to carry her there. Are you looking forward to the academy? He asked. Sakura made a noise. That's forever away, she mumbled. Chi-Chi laughed. It's this summer. Sakura blinked at him. It was. I'm not in the pre-academy group. Well, no, you're not. Here Chi-Chi looked kind of uncomfortable. Your mother was just going to teach you until then. After what happened last winter. It had been a year already. Huh. Anyway, you are catching up to where they were supposed to be about a month ago, and you're moving at a much faster pace than them, so you'll be plenty prepared by the next semester. Sakura squirmed. And Shin and Jiro are entering with me. Yep. Tu-san said. Won't it be nice to have your friends by your side? Sakura made a noise that sounded like agreement, and didn't protest when her father settled her next to a sleeping Shin and a playing Jiro. Have fun. Sakura turned and blinked at Jiro, who was holding a stuffed bear. What's its name? Bear. Jiro asked. It seemed as if he'd never questioned that it could be anything else. Boring, Sakura said. I'm going to name it Toad. It's a bear, Jiro said. Whose name is Toad? Sakura grinned. New goal for the party. Get Jiro to call his bear Toad. It is a bear, Jiro said. Yes, it is, Sakura replied. And his name is Toad. Sakura's first birthday had been a minor affair, overshadowed by those of her siblings that had happened in the weeks previous and afterward. Her second had been much grander, a sort of particularly spectacular celebration because it was apparently the first they thought she'd remember. Her third landed somewhere in between, with sweets and games but not as many siblings able to make it, not as much attention solely focused on her. What made her third birthday all the more memorable, however, was that the day after was the first time she was sent to study with the 6 other Yamanaka who were preparing for the next summer or winter entry to the academy. In terms of physical capabilities, Sakura couldn't hope to compete. She was far better than most other 3-year-olds, but she did not have the same coordination or speed as the 4, 5, and 6-year-olds she shared her lessons with. In terms of everything else, however, most of the others had to physically force their attention span to last longer than 30 minutes. Sakura regularly made it to an hour before she found her mind wandering. Most of the others could recite 15, maybe 20 plants and some of their qualities. She'd made it to 32. This pattern continued over nearly every lesson they were drilled in. It was she who understood chakra best, although admittedly far from perfectly, she who at least knew everything she was supposed to do to survive with only a basic shinobi kit in the woods, she who recognized the most weapons when they were placed in front of the group, she who usually managed to organize the timeline of historical events they'd begun to be coached in correctly. But she could still barely hold a kunai properly, much less a shuriken. She still gave up first when they ran any physical drills, who had to be corrected most when they went over kata. Her hands refused to cooperate when she tried to make hand signs. So, her pre-academy peers seemed very confused over whether or not to be jealous of her. This debate was quickly settled, however, when the 1-year-old Inoichi began to be placed in their lessons for a few hours a day, just to observe. The class's general consensus seemed to be that at least she was potty trained, so she couldn't be that bad. In June, however, with her start date only a month away, Sakura decided to do something she'd solemnly sworn not to. At night, when everybody from Ka-san to the 2-year-old Hamari was no doubt fast asleep, when the fans positioned strategically around the house did little to keep her hair from clumping against her face, she closed her eyes and, once more, opened the floodgates to Arden's memories. They whizzed by her the same as they had last time, crowding into her consciousness and leaving barely any room to breathe, to think, to act. But the horror she'd gone through with the evil doctor apparently had a purpose after all, because the sheer volume did not cause her to break as it had last time. Instead, she forced herself to ignore the great majority of it and instead grab one wisp of a memory, and then another. Arden had left her a trove of information and there was no way in hell she was going to the academy without having accessed even part of it. She grabbed the smallest string of memories she came across, a series of apparently connected bits of information that Arden apparently injected in sequence, bits that Sakura quickly realized contained Arden's actual life, and the first thing she learned was that by the time Arden was shoving information into her, most of it was long gone, already faded away as Arden eventually would be. There were still flashes, sure, a swing that she'd apparently spent much of her childhood on, an eerie memory involving something called a TV and towers falling and lots of crying, a happy memory, involving somebody, Arden's sister, throwing a bouquet and another girl screaming with joy as she caught it, the stress of a test superimposed onto the image of a gymnasium, filled with row after row of tables and chairs. Arden couldn't have been older than 20 when she died, but what memories remained showed a full life, one consisting of the same constant feeling of contentment that Sakura now found herself having in this life. Her memory of anatomy, however, was another story. There was more of it. For one, though Sakura knew this was also only a fraction of what Arden had learned in her own life. For another, it seemed like the explicit memories passed less easily into her memories of this world. After all, it was all too simple to ignore that none of her memories had any mention of chakra in them. It was far more difficult to dive into Arden's memories of learning about the human body and realize that chakra simply seemed to not exist. Even at 3, Sakura had been instructed of the benefits of the life force beyond simply being alive. Being able to use chakra, as humans could, allowed them to push their muscles farther, to make their brains work harder, to control nature in whichever way they dreamed, given enough knowledge and time. Arden's world didn't seem to have that. It was only as she'd finally reached Arden's information about skin, however, that she realized the sun was beginning to rise. In that time she'd managed to go through about 1/10,000th of what Arden left, and that was being optimistic. But she hadn't slept in about 24 hours now, and Himari was crying because she'd apparently wet the bed, and Ka-san was rushing into the room to deal with that, only to notice Sakura and her clear exhaustion, and before Ka-san had the time to freak out, Sakura stuttered out a lie about a really weird dream involving a monkey making tomato soup and her mother was checking her for a fever and telling her to stay in bed. Sakura did not touch the memories again until 2 days later, and then restricted herself to about half an hour a night. It wasn't enough to get through much of anything, was barely enough to search for a memory to look at, but she didn't trust herself to dedicate any more time to Arden. It had gone so wrong in the past, and if it felt like an option, Sakura would have preferred not dealing with the memories at all. By the time the next academy group started, she'd finished most of Arden's memories on human anatomy and come to the conclusion that at least half of it had to be irrelevant. She should have started with the memories she knew Arden had of her world, but she hadn't been able to find them at first, lost as they were in the sea of information. Still, she was reasonably sure anything would be better than an in-depth understanding of the human-like life form that Arden had been, a life form that did not exist, at least in carbon copy, here. On the other hand, her ability to remember and comprehend seemed to soar with each memory she did take in, regardless of its material, so she had managed to get the highest grades in her pre-academy class in everything remotely educational. Inoichi, now 1.5, could count to 10. He was applauded first. The academy, or at least the one Sakura was going to attend and the only one within Konoha proper, was positioned inside of the shinobi headquarters on one side of the building, which itself was positioned at the very edge of the city, opposite the main gate. The walk to get there wasn't really all that difficult. She and her mother, her father, unfortunately, having disappeared again shortly before her birthday, as well as the rest of the academy students, new and old, had simply turned left from the Yamanaka main gates, then right at the main road. It had been a bit of a long trip, admittedly. Most of the older children raced ahead at one point or another, tired of being held back by the speed of the sprouts. This was not Sakura's first time out and about in Konoha. She had, after all, had regular playdates with Nara Shin and Akamichi Jiro. The thing was, they always turned right out of the compound to get to them, crisscrossing major roads, sure, but not the main road, which meant that this was her first look at the street often called the spine of Konoha. It was busy, she supposed. It was early, too. The academy technically started at 7, but the Yamanaka always started their journey on the first day at 6. That meant that most of the traffic on the road now was either merchants and the like preparing their restaurants for the day or other students making their way to the same place they were, and it seemed like most of the latter were still asleep. Still, the sheer number of carts, horses, products, and people was much, much more than she was expecting. The only reason she knew it was technically reasonably empty was because the road could clearly support 4 or 5 times the amount, and because despite being lined with retail stores, no one seemed to be shopping and most shops seemed to be closed. Which made its business all the more notable, really. Besides that, though, the most impressive part of the road was the part they were headed straight towards. 3 faces carved out of stone, etched in painstaking detail, perfectly positioned so that at least one could be seen no matter where on the main road you stood. The Hokages, Sakura said. A cousin agreed, and began talking about why this was such a clear sign of the first Hokage's brilliance, when another cousin started to talk over the first, explaining why the third Hokage was obviously the best, despite, of course, having never met the man. Then another cousin interrupted, pointing out how his father was so amazing that he should be the Hokage. The adults smiled, happy to see the harmless debate wiping away the nerves all the children had been pretending didn't exist. Sakura was more preoccupied with how some part of her had recognized all the faces, despite having only met one of the men and never having seen a picture of any of the others. She really needed to get through Arden's memories. But now, when they'd finally arrived at the academy that was only now filling up with its first arrivals, was not the time. Almost unwittingly Sakura found herself being pushed away from her mother, away from her clan. One of her fellow Yamanaka yearmates, a stocky 5-year-old named Gaku, took the lead, ushering the rest of them into a swarm of similarly sized peers, somehow managing to place them smack dab next to the Nara clan children, with the Akamichi right in front of them. As the crowd continued to grow, Sakura found herself being moved once more. It wasn't intentional, exactly. Or perhaps it was, just not, specific to the individual. It was just that, whenever she recognized one of her pre-academy peers, partners, she'd help shove them closer based on where she knew they were, and whenever someone saw one of hers, they'd do the same. The whole Inoshika Cho thing had really been pushed on them pretty hard. Still, Sakura did find it strangely comforting to know that the ever-quiet Shin and gently inquisitive Jiro would be by her side, and it was nice to have them literally so when the crowd became so large that she started to be forced forward no matter what she did. Each boy grabbed one of her hands, as she was, by far, the smallest, and therefore the one least able to stop the force of the mob from pushing her to and fro, and physically held her in place. Jiro even, after a few minutes of the treatment, began to sneakily look for feet to step on, who cares if it happened to be his brother Kuro, so long as everyone stopped shoving. And Shin began to subtly maneuver them closer to the middle of the Inoshika Cho group, where there seemed to be less movement overall. Finally, a gong rang. In the time since their arrival, the small courtyard next to the school that every first-year student had flocked to had gone from having 70 or so inhabitants to easily over 200. Arato had told her once that most years started out around there. 256 in my class, he'd explained, but most leave over time, because a lot of civilians just want to take advantage of the free education. That said, generally by 10 there's less than 50. See, you take the group you start out with, and about half leave before the year's out, most during the first semester, which leaves 128. Then, the next full year, year 2, generally sees about 24 quit, which leaves, let's say 100. The next year, year 3, you don't see too many people leaving, maybe 10 or so, but year 4's where they really pump up the pressure, so that's generally where you drop down to about 50. Then you don't get many people dropping out during years 5 or 6, but that's because at the end of it you have the graduation exam, so most people are willing to stick it out until then, even if they don't really think they'll pass to become full genin. Sakura looked around. From her vantage point, with her height, she couldn't see much of anyone besides Yamanaka, Nara, and Akamichi, but she knew that the group of them together made up about 12 students in her year and semester. She wondered which of her cousins wouldn't want to stay, and whether their partners would leave with them. Not that she was supposed to be thinking like that, of course. Based on the words of the Hokage who was currently waxing poetic to the class, she was supposed to be thinking about how to support her fellow ninja, so they could all grow, flourish, and defend Konoha together. She thought of her fourth oldest brother, Kamui, who had dropped out when he was 9. He'd have defended Konoha if he had to, she knew, but she also knew that he would have wished to be anywhere else when he was doing it. Pain, both giving and receiving, had never appealed to him. Were there any others like those in her class, she'd make no effort to stop them from being happy, no matter how pretty the Hokage's words. But the man's words were still powerful, and before she knew it, Sakura had also determined to do as her mother had and try to convince them to try for just a bit longer just in case they might change their minds in the interim. He was talking about the will of fire now, and how trees, despite being generally considered incredibly flammable, would persevere during a forest fire, and come out stronger on the whole for it once it was over. His words seemed to pump energy into her veins, and she could suddenly picture herself fighting at Shinzenjuro's side, defending the people she loved and refusing to give up, even when all hope was lost, and winning because of it. The will of fire is in all of your veins, the Hokage finished, and it is here that you will learn to harness it. After a speech such as that, it was almost criminal for the academy head to simply start listing names for various classes in a droning monotone, completely killing the spirit it had achieved. There were to be 5 new classes, it was explained. Each time 2 classes dropped to less than 25, they would be merged. Interestingly, and without any official announcement proclaiming it, not one of the pre-made Inoshika Cho teams was split. Shin, Juro, and Sakura were all placed in classroom 3 under Sensei Masaru with little fanfare, and slowly, inch by inch, person by person, the crowd in the courtyard was formed into 5 vaguely militaristic series of rows, 5 across, 10 down, leaving nearly perfect rows given that each group had between 47 and 48 students. And then, with even less fanfare, each group was led to one of the top floor classrooms. The academy was 6 floors high. Sakura would be expected to take 5 flights of stairs at least 4 times a day, every day, up in the morning, out and in for physical lessons, and then down in the evening. Every day. Sakura understood a bit better, now, why so many quit in their first year. 5 of her classmates outright refused to move at various points and were abandoned where they sat. By the 5th staircase, each and every one achingly tall because apparently each level had to be at least 15 feet apart, Sakura was almost crawling. Sensei Masaru did not seem to care. Even when they finally arrived at the top, the apex, the goal, he did not allow them to stop to rest. Instead, they were promptly led into the first classroom on the left, where Sensei Masaru pointed to each desk one by one and announced who would be sitting where. Sakura was placed in the second row, smack dab between Shin and Juro, and behind 2 Hyuga and an Uchiha. The entirety of the first row and about half of the second, Sakura realized, were clan kids, with the rest of the class from the end of row 2 to 4 filled with average-looking children and orphans. The 5th, on the other hand, held those who were clearly richer or poorer than the rest of the class. She wondered if their placements had anything to do with how likely they would be to drop out. She thought they probably did. A number of the richer students in the back row were the most vocally displeased about the stairs, and wore clothing clearly unsuited for any kind of exercise, and Sakura knew the academy wasn't free, not really. It took time, more time than traditional schools, and no child was permitted to have another job while attending. The first and second row inhabitants that she recognized were more interesting. There were 3 Hyuga total, for instance, in this class, the twins who sat in front of her, as well as another who was to the very right in the second row. There were also 2 Uchiha, though she didn't think they were siblings, both sat in the front row. Making up the rest of the front row was a Shimura, 2 Sarutobi, and the other Inoshika Cho trio that had made it into the class. She knew them to be the niece and nephews of the current leaders. The rest of her row was taken up by a pair of Inuzuka twins and some of the more athletic-looking remaining students. As Sensei Masaru began, and everyone's eyes snapped to the front as if against their will, I'm sure you have noticed, you have all been organized in a very specific way. Simply put, the closer you are to the front, the more I expect you to stick around. I could be wrong, of course, and I welcome that chance as any would. I did, after all, prove my own sensei wrong, and I encourage all of you in the back to do the same. That said, You will not be moved up until you have proved to me that you have some modicum of skill. By the same token, you will not be moved back until you disappoint me." As if on cue, one of the stragglers pushed the door open. She was clearly an orphan girl. They were all given the same Uzu symbol to wear, in honor of their sister village, but there was no more room where the other three were sitting. Two of the other stragglers, a girl and boy, had changed their mind about giving up and managed to make it up in time to get those seats. Case in point, you, for your delay in changing your mind, will find that your seat is in the back row. Please find it before I decide that the seat isn't even in this building. She rushed forward and grabbed one, leaving only 5 seats bare. Sensei Masaru glanced at the clock, then nodded firmly. He turned towards the window and opened it, ignoring the room full of stairs, before making his way to the back of the room and picking up each empty seat one by one, taking his time as he did so. He then made his way to the front and, quite unceremoniously, chucked all 5 of them out the window. The class flinched when they clattered onto the ground. A few seconds later another clatter was heard, ostensibly from the same thing happening in the room next door. Just then, the classroom door opened again, revealing a red-faced boy who looked torn between flying into a rage and fainting in an effort to catch his breath. "You never answered my question about why we're on the top floor," he snapped. "That's very rude, you know. You could have at least carried me. You saw that I was having trouble." Sensei Masaru moved to the chalkboard in the front of the room and began to write out the day's schedule. "Hello. Can you hear me? Are you deaf?" Sakura stared at the boy in a sort of wide-eyed fascination. She'd never heard any child talk to an adult like that. She wondered who the boy was, that he seemed to believe he was the one deserving of respect. Oh, it seemed the boy had just realized the class had no empty chairs. "Where am I supposed to sit?" he whined. "I made it all the way up here, and I can't even sit down." The Uchiha in front of Jiro smirked and muttered, "You could always sit on the floor." You expect me to sit on the floor?" Sensei Masaru was still ignoring the boy, and had moved on to listing out the physical and mental requirements they were supposed to achieve by the end of the semester. The boy said. He was pointing at one of the orphans, the one closest to the right of the third row's table, where the path to file in and out was. "Stand up." The orphan, Yasuo, looked at the straggler, then at Sensei Masaru, then back at the straggler. He shook his head. "Do you hear me?" The straggler said. "My name is Saito Takashi. My uncle owns the most popular bank in Konoha. You are merely an orphan, with no family at all. When I tell you to do something, you do it." Yasuo glanced at Sensei Masaru again, who had yet to turn from the chalkboard and was now sketching out diagrams for their first lesson of the day, grammar, and then shook his head again. Takashi had apparently had enough, and stormed towards Yasuo, lifting his hand as he did. Yasuo flinched, but before the slap could connect, Sensei was there, holding Takashi's hand in a visibly painful vice grip and making no effort to move. Yasuo. "Yes, Sensei. Please switch seats with Toru and Izuka." "What did I do?" Toru snapped, but his sister Kagawa shushed him. "You were in the best position to stop this, and did nothing. Switch seats, now." It was true. Toru sat directly in front of Yasuo, and by the time Takashi had begun rushing forwards he had already been standing next to the Inuzuka, making it technically more difficult for the Sarutobi sitting at the end of the front row to have done something. Still, Sakura wasn't exactly sure what he was supposed to have done. Nevertheless, both boys carefully switched seats, slowly making their way around a statuesque Sensei Masaru and the suddenly mute and clearly terrified Takashi in his grip. "As for you, Saito, please go home, now, and explain to your mother, and your father, and your uncle, and every other family member you see fit to brag about, that you got kicked out of the academy. And please, I insist, tell them to come to me if they have any questions as to why." Sensei released his grip, Takashi released his bladder, and the two stepped apart far enough for the latter to slip out of the classroom almost faster than Sakura had time to blink. Neither of the other stragglers entered for the rest of the day, and Sakura wondered if they'd been thinking about it until they saw Takashi on his way out. Whatever they were thinking, those in the class knew the truth. No one would ever disobey Sensei Masaru, so long as they had the slightest bit of reasoning left in their bodies. None of this, however, made up for Sakura's subsequent realization: the academy was boring. Very boring. Very, very boring. She wondered if Arden had ever had to repeat a grade, like some in the academy did after their 6th year, and if she had any tips on how to deal with the mind-numbing boredom of having already gone over all the information previously. She was pretty sure that Shin's solution of staring blankly ahead and zoning out so completely that he never answered a single question wasn't ideal, but then Juro's plan of releasing an ant every day and trying to keep track of it until they left didn't seem that great either, and based on how some of her classmates were struggling, no pre-academy training was also a very bad idea, and too late to implement anyway. So instead she was stuck, bored out of her mind, while Sensei operated as if none of them knew anything more than addition and basic reading, but somehow also had the learning speed of a Nara. By the end of the first week, half of the 3rd row had dropped back a row, and half of the 4th row had moved forward. No one in the 1st or 2nd rows moved at all, including Yasuo, who somehow managed to eke past each test by increasingly narrow margins as he desperately tried to show he was worthy of his spot. The rest of the non-clan members in the 2nd row, on the other hand, looked to be relying on their brawn rather than their brain to maintain their positions, and so far it was working. As for Sakura, Shin, and Juro, they had yet to score anything but perfect marks, and still had private training at home to keep up with at the same time. This, of course, was par for clan children, but still. The other big thing about the academy was the people. Sakura had always liked people. She enjoyed spending time with her siblings, aunts and uncles, cousins, basically, anyone available. She just wasn't the best at initiating contact anymore. After her time in the White Room, in pain, the idea of simply wandering up to people as she used to filled her with a sort of undefined anxiety she found hard to control. This, as well as Shishin and Juro's own behavior, may have resulted in her Inoshika Cho team had picked up the collective name, Shinmoku, or silence, within the first week of the academy. While there was a reason for her acquired reticence, its benefit was that it did provide her with the time and circumstances necessary to observe her peers and try to understand as much as she could without direct questions. The Hyuga, for instance, were not fond of talking. The twins, Hazashi and Hiyashi, Sakura learned, were main house Hyuga, both of them 5 years old and hyper-competitive, but only to each other. They did not see any other as worth their time. The third, Hiroki, was a branch Hyuga, and only ever spoke to the twins, and only then to do whatever they wanted him to. Sakura tried not to think about that particular relationship too much. The Uchiha, too, she also had trouble getting to know. They were generally quite insular, and while they'd occasionally talk with the other children of the clans, including Team Shinmoku, they'd never talk to anyone else, and mostly just made conversation with each other whenever conversation had to be had at all. The Inuzuka, at least, were cheerful. While they were separated, Toru and Kagawa didn't let that stop them from talking regularly, even taking an inevitable punishment or two whenever they allowed their cross-row powwow to go on too long. They'd also talk to whomever was next to them, or seemed interesting, or happened to be in the same building. In short, while the Hyuga and Uchiha talked too little, the Inuzuka talked too much. Even they didn't talk to Sakura that frequently, though. They tried, at least, but found her odd for being so young and even odder for not seeming to be solely made of energy as they were. They got along a lot better with those who were already clearly taijutsu focused, those who wanted to wrestle and fight during recess, rules be damned. Out of the rest of the inhabitants of the first 2 rows, Sakura probably got along least with Shimura Ryota, and he more than anything was the cause for the scale of her shift in behavior, for all that it started well before the academy. The other clan kids were fine. Sarutobi children had much the same problem as the Inuzuka. Too much energy, too much emotion, all of it filling one small body, 2 times over. They were just as hard to dislike, however, because they, too, seemed to have an endless fountain of good humor to draw from, no matter what the situation. The other Inoshika Cho trio Sakura probably got along with best, even if they acted nothing like her own, her cousin being much more of a gossip, the Nara being cursed with a superiority complex, and the Akamichi clearly not wanting to be there at all. They'd earned the name Zatsuan, and wore the title with pride. Ryota Shimura, on the other hand, was nothing more than a bully. There was a girl in class, one of the orphans named Morino Sachiko, who, while fairly smart, had an awful stutter which she found impossible to control. Every day, at least once a day, Shimura would make sure to point out exactly how unsuitable for ninja work she must be, and once, when he was absolutely sure neither the sensei nor any of his classmates, except for Sakura, but how could he know she'd lagged behind the rest of the class out of some inexplicable sense of unease about how the only work she was suited for involved her on her back. Both Shimura and Morino were 5. And the worst, the most horrible part. Shimura was popular. It was, she supposed, part hero worship. The Shimura clan was a major clan even before the founding of Konoha, and their decision to move here was largely considered the reason the city ended up succeeding. It was also, she knew, his looks. He was tall, pretty, and athletic, even at his young age. What more could you want? His charisma, combined with his habit of taking others under his wing, probably helped, too, and by the end of the first month, he'd managed to get over half of the non-clan kids to start listening to his words as if they were gospel. But he also said those things to Morino, and actively pushed anyone he saw as unworthy, too feminine, too weak, too unfocused, too childish, to quit. He'd succeeded 3 times already. Sensei Masaru did not seem to care. Beyond the clan children, as well as the 3rd row Inuzuka, 2nd row Yasuo, and Morino Sachiko, there were 2 other orphans, 14 children from shinobi households, 2 children from poorer families, and 7 wealthier children remaining. If the same held true for the rest of the classes, then the school had already lost about 30 students. Sakura knew that about another 100 would leave before July came about again. She wondered if she could change that number, make it smaller, less devastating. After all, Kamui had left of his own free will, to pursue desires that a shinobi career simply couldn't. But the children who had already left, 2 of them had never made it to the classroom, and she couldn't see them persevering anyway, and another, Takashi, had made such a bad impression that Sakura would be amazed if he were allowed to re-enter the following year, an option generally left open to all first-year dropouts. But the other 3, the first had left in the first week, after he'd cried over not knowing an answer in class, and an hour later Shimura pinned him to a wall during recess and muttered something too softly for anyone to hear. The second had left nearly 2 weeks later, when Shimura had grown tired of her constant last-place position in races and set his newly acquired gang on her. She hadn't even made it through the day. The third had left just 3 days before the end of the month, when he had a panic attack shortly after lunch and sprinted out the door the second Shimura opened his mouth. The last had been part of Shimura's gang, actually, before that had happened. It didn't take too long for Sakura to piece together that this was what the academy wanted to happen. She found it hard to believe that anything escaped Sensei Masaru's notice, and yet he had not intervened once on the goings-on in class. So long as you didn't interrupt his lessons, in fact, he wouldn't impose discipline at all. There were rules, sure, no wrestling during recess, no stealing, no bullying. The problem was that the rules weren't enforced, that while the punishments for talking during a lecture were clearly outlined, the punishments for making a classmate cry weren't even worth a mention. Assuming they existed, of course. Her life did not start and end in the academy, though. After school she would ignore whatever had happened that day and instead run, and play, and read to her little sister Himari. But the largest change came thanks to the hours she spent every night lost in her own head. She still, even as winter approached, had yet to find the memories she knew existed of her own world. She'd searched for them, sometimes for the entire hour, but they were impossible to find amid the sludge of other information. To deal with that, then, she'd started taking some of it in. It just hadn't turned out to be as easy as she'd hoped. The math information, for instance, gave her such a migraine so quickly that she found herself forced to stop for the night. Similarly, she found that in terms of anything that had to do with chemistry took her anywhere from 5 to 10 tries to truly understand, and only when that happened would it stop clogging her brain once she unleashed the floodgates. She had managed to get through many of the stories, though, as well as basically all of Arden's understanding of English in both its spoken and written forms, but that was mainly because the latter was so interwoven with the rest of Arden's memories that every time she examined one it helped her understand the English memories a bit better too. Shortly after Akina and Arato's birthday, however, she came upon memories that actually seemed useful in the immediate future, Arden's understanding of psychology. There was a lot of it, to be sure, and not all of it was fully there, a problem shared with most of Arden's other memories, too, but it did contain some of Arden's world's views on ethics, which were from the beginning quite clearly far removed from Sakura's own, as well as the psychological experiments that had been so useful but had, all the same, prompted rules to be put in place to keep them from happening again. These experiments fascinated her. People, she already knew, were quite malleable creatures. With the right words, the right actions, you could get nearly everyone to do nearly everything. The problem was that as much as she knew that to be the case, as much as she saw it in action every day at the academy, she herself had not put much effort into practicing it herself. Sakura's life had been easy and simple, and she, like a significant portion of the rest of the Yamanaka clan, was likely expected to grow up to be a desk ninja, if a very good one, and live a life of relative ease within Konoha's borders. So playing mind games, it hadn't been the first thing on her mind. It wasn't as if the Yamanaka weren't gifted at them, they were, she knew, considered some of the best members of the T&I department, and the older she got, the more certain she became that that was where her mother worked every night, long after all her children had fallen asleep. It's just, Sakura had never really felt comfortable causing people pain. And as far as she could tell, it was not only the ability to manipulate, but also the ability to willingly and without remorse hurt someone that made a good T&I shinobi. Frontline shinobi, of course, hurt plenty of people too, but they did it in the moment, when their opponent was a direct threat to the lives of themselves and their comrades. Ninjas specializing in assassination also had an easier time of it. Their target may not be an immediate threat, but they were still clearly a threat. Those in T&I took enemies already neutralized and then hurt them all the more, to get out even the slightest drop of information that that enemy may have, regardless of whether or not another source had already given them what was necessary. And Sakura didn't know if she could be capable of that, so she'd never tried. That said, the psychology in her mind thrilled her, and seeing it in action in her classroom day to day made it all the more real, all the more powerful. She saw children placed in positions of power doing things they normally would never dream of, not because they were told to do it but simply because of the addictive nature of the power coursing through their brains. She saw one boy in Shimura's gang begin to question whether it was really right to kick another boy in the stomach when he was already down, only to cave into peer pressure and agree that, really, he deserved it. She saw herself unable to defend these children, and pushing herself all the more in taijutsu to make up for that perceived failure. She saw the constant reminders of the power of the leaf and the danger of other villages expounded in every lecture, every effort being made to ensure her peers saw anything not them as a threat, as something that might need to be exterminated. The academy, really, was quite good at what it did. It took children and made them into soldiers. It took unmolded clay, and made someone who could think, but knew when not to, who could follow rules but break them given the right motivation, who could murder, and come out the other end relatively unscathed. Sakura knew all this, but she still drank in ardent psychological knowledge every night. If there was any better, any less painful way to get the same results, then she'd try to make it happen, no matter how difficult the concept was. In the meantime, however, she continued to find herself cursed with an inability to get up the courage to act. The end of the semester brought a series of guest speakers to the class, one for each official shinobi discipline. The police force was discussed first, likely because the speaker ended up being so brief. Both civilians and shinobi worked there, and anyone could apply, but the force was overwhelmingly Uchiha. Should any of them choose to be in the police force, then they were expected to be competent in terms of ability to subdue without killing, find information, lead, and deal with a multitude of different assignments at once. The tracking shinobi, who went next, was a bit more talkative. He was an Inuzuka, and explained that shinobi who specialized in tracking generally had three kinds of missions: tracking down missing peoples, of both the ninja and civilian variety, tracking down missing objects, generally those whose worth was more than anyone who would touch it in its lifetime, and acting as scouts, figuring out who had gone where, if the borders were safe, how an unseen battle played out. Academy students wanting to be good at tracking would be, amazingly enough, expected to know how to track. They would also be expected to be fairly good at taijutsu and breaking genjutsu, and have a good amount of stamina besides. Being an academy instructor, the next speaker's specialty, was an entirely different matter. An academy instructor, the speaker explained, was simply a stepping stone to better offices. Academy instructors tended to become chunin instructors, yes, but the main pull for becoming one was better than average pay and the chance to work in the Hokage's office. Not only that, but out of their 3 Hokage who had ruled, 2 had spent some time as chunin teachers, however short. Nearly all the elders had taught at the academy in their youth too. Being an academy instructor was, apparently, where you went if your goals were political in nature. A harried-looking doctor followed the academy instructor, and went on for a bit too long about the need for more medical nin, about the power they had to save lives. It seemed to be his first time speaking in front of such a large group, and it showed. Next was T&I, which Sakura mostly tuned out. She'd heard the speech in its various forms played out too many times at her clan residence to need the refresher, and could probably have recited it in its entirety from memory before the speaker even began. The research division, spoken for by an oddly buzzing Aburame, went next. This was a job that Sakura actually found herself interested in, and she listened more intently than she had to the others as the kunoichi talked about technology and its power to change the world. All too soon the speech was over, and a saboteur ninja had taken the floor. And promptly left. Apparently, all they had to know was that they existed. The saboteurs would be keeping an eye out to see if there were any academy students they wanted, not the other way around. She wondered if they were actually Anbu. It seemed likely. The frontline speaker went next, a stocky Sarutobi who was actually the father of one of her classmates. Yamanaka were rarely frontline, so it wasn't particularly interesting to her, but her classmates on the whole seemed thrilled, outright leaning forward as he described massive battles involving ninjutsu and taijutsu and kinjutsu and so much chakra in the air that it was hard to breathe. Evidently, her peers missed the sentence where he mentioned that less than a third left that battle alive. The day was wrapped up with a speaker from the cryptology department who, like the saboteur before him, barely spoke before leaving. Aoi, she suddenly remembered, had talked about an interest in cryptology in passing before dropping out of the shinobi forces. She wondered what, exactly, the department did. After the speeches were over, each child was given a small card to outline their current top 3 choices on. They would be expected to do so once a semester every semester until graduation, to see where their interests lay and how they changed over time. The Chinmoku gathered together, and Sakura put pen to paper first. Research. Next was Shin, who thought for a second, then put down. Cryptology. Jiro went last, and took his time before finally writing down. Medical nin. Then all three copied the other's answers on their own cards, before turning them in. Inoshika Cho did nothing separately until chunin, and that included choosing what they would do as a chunin. Never mind that they rarely had the same desires, unity was more important than honesty. She did, however, wonder why they'd chosen what they had. It wasn't so much unexpected, as it was unexpectable. Perhaps they should do as the other Inoshika Cho team had, and actually talk. Or perhaps, she thought as she noted the other team furiously arguing in the corner, apparently no closer to filling out their papers as they had been at the start, there were some benefits to silence after all. Ren's marriage to Iku, for a reason that was not well explained to Sakura when she asked, took place with almost no warning on a dreary Sunday in the middle of February. A good chunk of both the Yamanaka and Nara clans had attended to wish the two off on their journey, as well as a number of Ren's co-workers in T&I, who spent the majority of the time teasing Ren about marrying a girl who was over half a foot taller than him. Despite the weather, it was a nice ceremony, and the two that took center stage clearly loved each other. Iku, Sakura knew, had never made it past Genin, but hadn't really wanted to and took her retirement from the forces in good grace, instead going into the much more day-to-day job of working for the Yamanaka library. That said, she had apparently taken her retirement too well. She'd only officially left the summer previous, and as Sakura found out during the ceremony, the wedding took place in February, less out of any particular love for the chilly month and more out of a desire to have the wedding done with before Iku began to show. Still, it was pleasant, and both families were having a relatively good time. Sakura, Shin, and Jiro had found a bench near one of the corners to sit on after their exhaustion finally caused them to give up their individual battles to eat their body weights in sweets, and instead all three sat companionably at the edge of the hubbub, watching their families interact as they themselves slipped by unnoticed. It was the year 27 Konoha, and life was good. This, of course, could not last. It wasn't that a world war was on the horizon, thankfully. That particular aspect of life had ended in 16 Konoha, and hadn't been back since. The problem was more personal than that. Ren, now 18, and Iku had settled down 2 blocks from Sakura's house by the end of spring, and she and the rest of the family were frequent visitors to ensure Iku was doing well despite her pregnancy. 16-year-old Sayuri was now officially dating her former best friend Yua's older brother, but had left for a long-term mission with a tracking team, one she did not have a return date from. Aoi, halfway through his 14th year, was still missing, and everyone was still acting as if that did not matter. Kamui had also moved out of the house, disappearing into a world of spices and specific meat cuts under the eyes of a watchful Akimichi chef. Akina and Arato were due to become genin in the summer. They, like Aoi, had begun mentioning possibly quitting despite, like Aoi, having shown no inclination to do so in the past. Ka-san didn't even blink. Ayame was fresh-faced as ever, taking on the academy with as much fervor as anyone could ask for. Her goal, she had decided, was to be one of the first female frontline Yamanaka since their joining the village. She still couldn't do a single jutsu. Fujio was also doing well in the class 2 semesters above Sakura's own. He was, she understood, in the top half of his class in everything but taijutsu, and so had begun nagging Akina and Arato to tutor him in what little free time they had. Kohana, now 5, was finally in the pre-academy class, but she'd already begun to make noises about preferring to do just about anything else. While she had enjoyed running and jumping and playing as a toddler, the more serious the lessons got, the less she seemed to enjoy them, and she'd begun to make wistful eyes at their clan's flower shop rather than practice the required katas. Sakura was still unraveling the ocean of stories that plagued her brain every night. Himari, at almost nearly 3, had found that she liked to climb onto the roof whenever anyone's back was turned. And Kaide, 13-year-old Kaide, who shared a birthday with Sayuri, who was Kamui's doppelganger in every physical aspect one could mention. Kaide, who was sweet, and gentle, and kind, and always willing to lend a hand. Ren's wedding had taken place on a chilly day when the clouds were so numerous and so overladen that they nearly drooped to the ground. Shortly before the wedding ended, they'd released their burdens, pouring down a waterfall onto the partygoers rushing to get home. Kaide's funeral took place on a day without a cloud in the sky, when the humidity was oddly absent, and a slight breeze kept it from being too hot. It took place in May, with the flowers in full bloom and bird chirps filling the air. Kaide's funeral took place on the day after they'd found out he'd died, and that day had occurred only several hours after Sakura had uncovered Arden's first memory of the world she knew, a memory which showed an animation of a crazy man threatening to kill everyone in Konohagakure. Sakura had shoved back that memory, resolving to go to sleep and deal with it the next day, but the next day. They weren't told how he died, and they weren't given a body to claim, and Sakura's throat was closed so tightly she worried she'd lost the ability to speak and eat permanently. He was a genin, she knew, and every genin was put in potentially life-threatening situations, but it was different when the genin was your brother. When it was his funeral you had to visit with tears burning your eyes and incense burning your nose and the image of a madman burning your brain. Tu-san had appeared from nowhere to lead the funeral. He hadn't been there in nearly a year, having been who knows where doing who knows what for the Fire Nation, but he'd appeared quite unexpectedly on the day of the funeral and led the hand-washing, the incense burning, and the tablet inscription. No one spoke. Ka-san had put her into simple, undyed, hemp clothing the night before, and Sakura found everyone else in similar outfits when she awoke, so the scene outside the temple was a sea of beige cloth, blonde hair, pale skin, and red eyes. Sakura tried not to cry too loudly, she'd been instructed to be as silent as possible. When the funeral rites were finally complete, and her brother's name had been inscribed on the tablet of those bound for the afterlife, each Yamanaka, Nara, Akamichi, and other attendee was given a single flower by the priest. Only when every member had been handed one did each, as one, begin to tear the flower apart, a reminder of the lasting impact of Kaide's death, and how more than one life was affected by it. The thing was, Sakura had been so busy, so constantly forcing her mind to absorb more, that it seemed Ren's wedding had only been the day before. She could remember being pressed between Jiro and Shin against one of the walls, watching the smiling faces around them as they tried desperately to stay awake until it was time to leave. She remembered the beauty and the abundance of flowers, which had taken up every nook and cranny available, making the ceremony awash with every color in one's imagination, the clothing in every style imaginable, the laughter coloring the air in every hue. To go from that to pale people, pale clothing, even pale flowers, in the space of what still felt like less than a week. Sakura tried to swallow past the knot in her neck. She didn't really succeed. She was 4 years old, and she had just lost her first sibling. She knew it wouldn't be her last.